Throughout human history, there have been moments that have shaken empires, sparked revolutions, and changed the very fabric of society. These pivotal events irrevocably altered the course of the world as we know it. Explorations into machines that could take people up into the air and across large masses of land and sea have been a venture for centuries. Leonardo da Vinci began his studies into flight back in the late 1400s, and he began drawing detailed crafts such as the ornithopter and the aerial screw. But these ideas never made their way past the drawing pad. They never materialized into machines that would pave the way to modern aircraft. This wasn't the end of flight exploration though, and many great inventors, designers, and enthusiasts made their attempts as well. It wasn't until 1903 that the first successful voyages into flight machines would be made. The success, of course, didn't happen overnight, but if it wasn't for the perseverance of Wilbur and Orville Wright, it wouldn't have happened at all. The Wright brothers had long been tinkering with the idea of flight. In fact, they first conceived the idea in their childhood. The two youngsters were mechanically inclined and inspired by prior efforts. In 1878, their father Milton had brought home a rubber band-powered helicopter toy. Instead of simply falling to the ground as expected, the toy flew across the room until it struck the ceiling, fluttered for a little while, and then finally made a landing on the floor. While the fragile item eventually broke, the boys never forgot about it, and for years, they would create their own flying toys. Throughout their later life, the brothers would be involved in various other trades, all in an effort to make money. This left very little time for other projects, halting their escapades into creating flying machines. When the Wright Cycle Company was formed though, Orville and Wilbur found themselves with much more time. And so in 1899, their very serious work into aviation began. Wilbur had written to the Smithsonian for literature on related works, but was disappointed to find that others before them had made very little progress in their efforts. He had taken the lead in the project to solve the problems of flight, and it didn't take long for Orville to be drawn in as an equal. Each was developing their own theories, and for the next 4 years, they would devote much of their time and energy to one specific goal: human flight. The pair had already figured out that they would need to refine the solution to lift and propulsion, but they also needed to achieve lateral control. As a forerunner to their real aircraft, the Wrights constructed a 5-foot biplane kite. While it was a success, they realized very quickly that the area they were living in did not have suitable weather conditions for such flying experiments. After finding a suitable area to conduct the experiments, the confident brothers created a 17-foot glider with an unusual forward elevator. Unfortunately, the wings generated less lift than expected, and despite leaving discouraged, the pair sharpened their focus the following year. It was 1901, and their solution was to increase the camber of the glider, but again it failed. In 1902, they constructed another machine, which was the embodiment of all the Wrights' research. It had 32-foot wings and vertical tails. To fly, the pilot would move the hip cradle to warp the wings. While this method and design did work, it was still flawed, and the pilot would encounter various issues. A year later, on the 17th of December, 1903, the brothers dressed themselves in coats and ties. They were confident that this attempt would be the breakthrough. That morning, they headed to a remote, sandy beach. Words couldn't be heard over the engine of their new and improved craft, so the brothers shook hands as Orville climbed into the flyer. The plane broke contact with the Earth and glided over a 12-second distance. For the first time in all of human history, a manned, heavier-than-air machine had left the ground by its own power, moved with control, losing no speed, and landing again at a point as high as that from which it started. It was the Wright brothers who inaugurated the aerial age with their successful efforts into the first powered, heavier-than-air flying craft. It was just one fateful trip that changed the course of the world. It was the travels of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who had arrived in the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia. Ferdinand was the Inspector General of the army in 1913. On the 28th of June, he and his wife Sophie found themselves in the province where the Archduke was on Inspector General business of the Imperial Army. Their visit was not a popular one, and it came at a time when the Balkan politics were turbulent and when the Kingdom of Serbia coveted Bosnia. It wasn't just politics that had caused some turbulence that day, but also the 28th marked the anniversary of Turkish victory over Serbia. It was a day filled with upset and tension, fanning the flames of dissent among the nationalists. As the royal pair traveled in ignorant bliss amid a procession of motor vehicles through Sarajevo in their roofless car, crowds cheered them on. It was just after 10 a.m. when a blackened object bounced off the back of the vehicle. It had been tossed by Nagiko Pravanatic and exploded behind them. The blast caused injuries to the entourage and peppered the bystanders with bits of shrapnel. The royal couple were unharmed and continued their trip to the reception at City Hall. The attack had certainly shaken the pair, so they opted to alter their schedule and rather head to the hospital to check up on one of the officers who'd been injured that morning. The Archduke and his Duchess were still between the motorcade, but there was confusion in the plans that would be taking place, and since some of the vehicles, including theirs, backed down the road where Pravanatic had been. But the Bosnian Serb was not alone and was part of a 6-man conspiracy that lay in wait to assassinate the Archduke. At 11 a.m., the vehicle entered a side street to turn around and head toward the hospital. Just then, the 19-year-old Fabrilo Princip approached the car. He was affiliated with the Black Hand Society, a society tied to the Serbian government. Princip seized his opportunity and drew his Browning pistol. 2 bangs echoed through the street that day. Both the Archduke and the Duchess had been wounded. In haste, the driver sped off toward the hospital, but it was too late, and the royal couple were gone. It was this assassination that ultimately prompted the First World War. Tensions were running high among Europe's powers already, with this act precipitating a rapid descent into the Great War. First, Austria-Hungary would gain the support of Germany for punitive actions against Serbia. They then gave their enemy an ultimatum, one that made acceptance highly unlikely. While the country proposed a resolution, Austria-Hungary had other plans in mind. Just 1 month following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war. Just a week later, Germany, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Montenegro had been roped into the conflict. From there, the bodies began piling up. 16 million people became casualties of the war. Some were soldiers and others were civilians. Those 2 bangs that ricocheted through the streets on the 28th of June in 1914 sparked a fatal war that lasted 4 years, in which many would lose their lives in the fighting. The decade referred to as the Roaring Twenties was an era of economic and social growth within the US. This period had great influence on the New York Stock Exchange. Share prices had risen to unprecedented heights. The industrial average increased 6-fold from 63 to 381. The peak in prices led economist Irving Fisher to proclaim that his stock prices had skyrocketed to what appeared to be a permanently high plateau. But this epic boom would come to a cataclysmic halt, beginning on the 24th of October in 1929. It was Black Thursday, and the market had opened at 11% lower than the previous day. Financiers stepped in with bids above the price in an effort to stem the panic. Stocks bounded back over the following day, but this was short-lived. Black Monday followed, with the Dow seeing a 13% decline. Black Tuesday saw the market drop 12%. By the middle of November, the Dow was at half its value, a slippery slope that continued to slide throughout the year and pressed on until 1939. Dow had closed the 20th century 89% below its peak. The Roaring Twenties were over, and it was the start of a new era, the era of the Great Depression. The stock market crash wiped out corporate and individual wealth. The price of large blue-chip stocks saw a decline, and the smaller companies suffered even more. Many companies were forced to declare bankruptcy. The crash impacted every segment of society, altering the entire perspective and relationship of the generation with the financial markets. Everyone had lost money. Investors and businesses had put high amounts of cash into the market, all of which was now lost. People lost their savings and businesses crashed. The Great Depression was the longest and most severe depression experienced by the Western world. It sparked fundamental alterations in economic institutions, economic theory, and macroeconomic policy. Despite being rooted in the United States, the Great Depression impacted the whole world. Many were out of jobs, unemployment was now a norm, and drastic declines in output were documented worldwide. Every single country felt the effects of the catastrophic stock market crash. It wasn't until 1933 that the United States was set on the path to recovery. The output had risen greatly, but in the later 1930s it suffered severe downturn. It wasn't until 1942 that things began to stabilize in the US, allowing other countries to begin recovering too. The recovery, though, varied greatly for the rest of the world. While Great Britain, Canada, and Latin American countries began to strengthen, other countries were still suffering a severe depression, including France. The aftermath saw the US federal government creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to secure a permanent deposit insurance system, and President Roosevelt's New Deal programs offered relief and recovery. The stock market crash forever marred history, leading to the Great Depression and ultimately distrust of financial markets. It was the time of the Second World War. Germany's army, navy, and air force had made use of coded messages to relay secret transmissions between one another. These encrypted codes ranged from top-level signals to detailed situation reports that had been prepared by generals at the battlefronts or orders signed by the dictator himself. Reports would come down to the trivial details of war and inventories on supply ships. All these messages were unknown to the Allies, leaving them at a poor disadvantage in the war. These codes were being generated by a typewriter-like machine known as Enigma. Each keystroke had replaced a character in the message with another, each determined by the machine's setting and wire arrangements that had already been established between the sender and receiver. For additional security, the military would double encrypt the secret message by encrypting the message and then encoding the first encryption again, making the messages almost impossible to decipher. But Germany didn't have one particular individual coming. It was Alan Turing, a brilliant mathematician. On the first day of the war, Turing had taken up residence in an ugly Victorian Buckinghamshire mansion known as Bletchley Park. At this time, it was serving as a wartime headquarters for Britain's top codebreakers. Bletchley Park not only recruited mathematicians, but also linguists and chess champions. Turing's logical skill and mathematical advantage made him the perfect candidate for a natural cryptanalyst who's responsible for breaking coded messages. Alan Turing may not be a household name, but he created an electromechanical device that allowed them to detect the settings on the Enigma machine. This ultimately allowed the codebreakers at the headquarters to not only intercept, but also decrypt the encoded messages, giving the Allies an upper hand and ultimately tipping the balance of the war. German Air Force signals were being read at Bletchley, and the intelligence they were gaining was aiding the war effort. Turing was also responsible for decrypting the more complex communications of the German Navy. The German U-boats had been inflicting great losses on Allied shipping, and the Allies' understanding of the signals was crucial in preventing this. This allowed the interceptors to decode the naval Enigma codes from 1941 and allowed the Allies to direct the U-boats away. It was Turing's cracking of the Enigma code that ultimately ended the Second World War. He stands with Churchill, Eisenhower, and the other wartime heroes as a leading figure in the Allies' victory over the German dictator. The operation and Enigma code breakthrough shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. It was 1955, and Rosa Parks was looking to head home. She'd just finished a hard-working day as a seamstress in the basement of the Montgomery Fair department store in Alabama. Rosa was 42 at the time and would be hosting a youth group meeting later that night with the local NAACP. At an early age, she became aware of the daily injustices faced by African Americans through Jim Crow segregation laws. By this time, she was already an activist for racial equality, and much like others in her situation, Rosa Parks had enough. It was the 1st of December when she left her basement workplace on a Thursday. Upon arriving at the bus stop, she discovered that it was overcrowded, so she headed to a local drugstore instead. There, she'd purchase an electric heating pad, thinking she may be able to get a seat on the bus if she just waited a while. Sometime later, Rosa deposited her 10-cent fare on the Cleveland Avenue bus and made her way to the first row at the back of the bus. The section had been reserved for people of color. The bus still began filling up at each stop, and when each seat was full, changes were made. A few stops later, the bus driver ordered Rosa to get up so that the passenger who just boarded could sit down. The passenger was American, but instead of doing as she was told, the activist stayed in her place. The sign placed in the section of the bus was movable, allowing the driver to move it further back if he so pleased. It was right then and there that Rosa decided that she was not going to get up and moved to the row behind her, prompting the driver to call the police. She was arrested for violating the Montgomery segregation laws. While a phone call was permitted, news of the arrest spread quickly without it. The information landed on the ears of E.D. Nixon. 2 hours later, after a $100 bail, Rosa had been released. Nixon, who'd been searching for a courageous African American for years, waited for her outside. No one knew it at the time, but Rosa's release would be the start of a very powerful revolution. Nixon accompanied the woman to her home, and the two spoke of the idea of becoming a plaintiff in what would become a test of the validity of segregation laws. But during this conversation, another idea had arisen. The African American population would need to boycott the buses on the day of Rosa's trial. By midnight, the plan was set, and 35,000 flyers were being sent out. The then young minister Martin Luther King Jr. would lead the Montgomery bus boycott. On the day of the boycott, the 5th of December, Rosa was found guilty of violating the segregation laws. While she was being fined $10 and another $4 in court costs, the protest had a much larger community than anticipated. As the movement pressed on, lawsuits began making their way up through the court system, eventually to the U.S. Supreme Court. The boycott had angered much of the population and even engineered violence toward the activists. Despite this, the boycotters persisted. The efforts gained national notoriety and even international press disclosure. Finally, on the 13th of November, 1956, the Supreme Court found that bus segregation was unconstitutional and illegal, a pivotal point in the rights for African Americans. Rosa Parks has been named the mother of the civil rights movement. It was her refusal to give up her seat and a bus driver's defiance that led to the turning point in the civil rights movement. The moment that she refused to give up her seat was the start of a crucial change. Just under half a century after the Wright brothers invented the airplane, humans began to send stuff into space. It began with the Soviet Union and the world's first ever artificial satellite, Sputnik. The spacecraft was named after the Russian word for fellow traveler. The craft had a diameter of 22 inches and weighed more than 180 pounds. On the 4th of October in 1957, at exactly 10:29 p.m., Sputnik blasted from its launch base. It was at this very moment that the Soviet Union had inaugurated the space age. The satellite had circled the planet once every hour and 36 minutes. It traveled at 18,000 miles an hour. Its orbit had an apogee of 584 miles and a perigee of 143 miles. Equipped with just a simple pair of binoculars, Sputnik could be seen just after sunset and before sunrise. It was transmitting radio signals back to Earth, ones that were strong enough to be received by amateur radio operators. Back in the United States, those with access to radio equipment listened in awe of the faint beeping sound as the space item passed over the continent several times each day. The launch of the Sputnik sent the eyes of the Earthlings traveling up to the stars. Those faint beeps were signaling the dawn of the space race. In January of the following year, Sputnik's orbit deteriorated and it burned up in the atmosphere, an expected ending to the temporary spacecraft. It would be the first of many satellites to be sent into orbit. The United States and Russia began their competition in developing better, newer spacefaring technology. The launch of Sputnik was followed by the United States' first satellite, the Explorer, which was sent out in 1958. But America was still behind in the space race, with the Soviets already having sent another craft into orbit. It was Sputnik 2, this time accompanied by a dog. They would go on to achieve many of space's firsts, including that of the first man in space, the first woman, the first 3 men, the first spacewalk, the first moon impact, first moon orbit, the first Venus image, and they were also credited with being the first to have a craft soft land on the moon. With all these firsts, America was now much further behind, but in the late 60s, they opted to take a giant leap forward. The US leapt far ahead in the space race with the Apollo lunar landing program, successfully landing 2 Apollo 11 astronauts on the surface of the moon. Sputnik paved the way for thousands of satellites in space exploration. It marked the beginning of the era of cell phones, television, the internet, and surveillance, which played a key role in gathering intelligence. Books, especially those with a controversial subject, are an incredibly powerful and influential thing. Such pieces of writing have the ability to alter the world as we know it. This is why so many of them are banned or prevented from being used as prescribed reading material in schools. Such influential books that have been barred over the years include To Kill a Mockingbird, The Hate U Give, Of Mice and Men, and The Glass Castle. One book, though, managed to slip through the cracks of censorship. It was Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Carson was already a celebrated American biologist and author by the time she published her book in 1962. Prior to the publication of Silent Spring, the author was most noted for her trilogy of lyrical books on the ocean. Silent Spring had sent shockwaves through communities. Referred to as her poison book, Carson brought to light something that could only be guessed at: the damaging effects of the use of chemical pesticides on the environment. She'd focused her attention mainly on a particular insecticide, known as DDT. This chemical had previously been boasted as the greatest discovery of the Second World War for its ability to abolish insects that spread typhus and malaria. DDT was routinely sprayed over crops and in homes. People were living intimately with these chemicals, and Carson wanted them to know something about their power. While the scientific community had already been aware of the dangers that these chemicals had posed to human and animal life, Carson became the first to make the information not only accessible to the public, but palatable to the masses. She wasn't writing for the scientific community, but for the general public, such as housewives who regularly made use of the chemicals, factory workers, and farmers. The argument was that everyone should have the right to know the risk of what they're being exposed to on a daily basis. In order to give readers a better understanding of the dangers of pesticides, Carson drew parallels between chemicals and nuclear weapons, framing the issues as siblings. Silent Spring first drew attention in June of 1962, when The New Yorker ran 3 excerpts. By the fall, the book was in high demand and became a bestseller. In the first 3 months, it had sold over 100,000 copies, and in 2 years, more than 1 million. As expected, the chemical company's reactions were explosive. An industry spokesperson dismissed the claims as absurd, while another listed her as hysterical, a communist, radicalist woman. The DDT company presidents have even stated that Carson hadn't written Silent Spring as a scientist, but rather as a fanatic defender of the cult that seeks to balance and protect nature. At first, she didn't write the book due to the anticipated attacks, but after a few years, Carson decided that the personal risks were worth it. Carson's informative and controversial book was the catalyst that inspired the environmental movement that sparked off in the 60s, gaining international momentum during the 70s. Silent Spring's controversy ultimately led to the establishment of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It also prompted various new laws to come into effect in an effort to protect the environment and human health. Such laws included the ban in domestic use of DDT. The publication led to growth in green chemistry, a term used to describe the design, development, and implementation of chemical products to reduce or completely eliminate hazardous substances and their threat to human and animal life. On the 1st of January, 1983, the world changed forever. It was the official birthday of the internet. But the internet had already been conceived in 1962 when military experts became concerned with the potential attack on their telephone systems by the Soviet Union, who had just launched the first satellite into space. One ARPA scientist had a solution: an intergalactic network of computers that could talk to each other. This would allow government officials to continue to communicate if the telephonic systems were down. In 1965, another scientist, Donald Davies, developed a way that would allow information to be sent from one computer to another through a method he named packet switching. On the 29th of October, 1969, the first message was delivered from one computer to the other, each the size of a large room. The message was simply the phrase "log in," but the other computer only received the first two letters of the word, and by the end of that year, only 4 computers were connected to what was dubbed the ARPANET. But as the 70s drew in, it only progressed. In the mid-70s, a computer scientist, Vinton Cerf, started solving many of the issues that were still being experienced. He developed a way for all computers on the world's many networks to communicate. His invention was called Transmission Control Protocol, which was described as the handshake that introduced different and distant computers to each other in virtual space. This protocol ultimately transformed the concept of the internet into a worldwide network, and by the 80s, researchers and scientists were using it to send data and files between different computers. In 1983, ARPANET and the Defense Data Network officially changed to the TCP standard, making it the birth of the internet as we know it today. From here, we saw the establishment of the World Wide Web. It was not simply an internet that allowed the receiving and sending of files, but it was itself a web of linked information that anyone could access. From here, only more improvements would be made. A group of students at the University of Illinois had developed a browser called Mosaic, a user-friendly way to search the internet. Mosaic allowed any user to see words and pictures on the same page. They were also able to navigate using scroll bars and click on clickable links. The first decade of the 2000s saw more developments. It was the dawn of social media platforms that changed the way that people connected, shared content, and created. And just like that, the world became faster and smaller than it had been just 50 years prior. Business transactions could happen at the speed of thought. Communication was easier. Political movements would be known globally, and people all over the world could connect. The creation of the internet allowed easier access of information, opened the world of social networking, and provided a chance for education, job opportunities, online purchasing, and entertainment. The quiet evolution of the internet reshaped the global economy and fostered a new era of communication. Margaret Thatcher may only be a household name in some areas. She was the British Conservative Party politician and the Prime Minister. Thatcher was described as gutsy, and she routed Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan, smashing the gender barrier and becoming Europe's first ever female Prime Minister. She was also the only Prime Minister of the 20th century to have won 3 consecutive terms, and was the only one to have served the longest up until her resignation. Thatcher accelerated the British economy's evolution from statism to liberalism, becoming the most renowned political leader since Winston Churchill. With her upcoming politics and leadership style, Thatcher would become known as the Iron Lady, who advocated for greater independence of the individual from the state. When the Iron Lady was elected, she would inherit a weakened economy, a problem she sought to solve. Thatcherism was the term used to refer to new policies that came into effect, as well as the ethical outlook that the Prime Minister had. The term was used to encapsulate her moral absolutism, fierce nationalism, and her regard for the interest of the individual. Policies were brought into effect with the intention of reversing high inflation and Britain's struggle amid the winter of discontent. In search of emphasizing individual liberty, Thatcher's policies saw the privatization of state-owned companies and reduced the power and influence of the trade unions. But amid her first term in office, the Iron Lady found her popularity waning. This was because Britain had been placed in the midst of a recession. With rising unemployment, the public turned against the PM, and she became an unfavorable individual. Despite this, Thatcher maintained her ground and led a victory over the 1982 Falklands War. This allowed the economy to recover, bringing a resurgence in support. She was re-elected in 1983, a term that would see her deregulate the United Kingdom financial market, leading to an economic boom. For the 11 years that Thatcher served, she implemented sweeping reforms, transformed the stagnant economy, tamed the unions, and ultimately re-established Britain as a world power. With the aid of the United States presidents, Reagan and Bush, she was able to bring the Cold War to an end, leading to the demise of the Soviet Union. Margaret Thatcher has since been boasted as a woman who broke the Union's stranglehold on Britain, pushed the business world out of complacency, and changed the welfare state mentality. Her conservative creed had changed the entirety of Britain, and subsequently, the rest of the world. It was the 1930s, and Ibn Saud was the king of Saudi Arabia. The tribe was nomadic and living in a country whose economy was based solely on tourism revenue from pilgrimages to the holy city of Mecca. It would also be this year that the king had allowed a team of American engineers to explore the desert that bordered the Persian Gulf. It was an arid landscape, a trackless mass marked only by the rare palm-fringed oasis. Saud was hoping that the Americans would find water. The tribal leader found himself with precarious finances and believed that the Americans would discover areas where his men could refresh the horses and camels. But the team, which was from Standard Oil of California, had something else on their mind. Oil had been discovered previously in other countries of the region, but the engineers thought that they might find much more in Saudi Arabia. Upon being given authorization, they began to drill. A dozen holes, and several years later, they still found nothing. Their efforts yielded no results, but in desperation, Standard Oil dug deeper and deeper into the arid land. The men were reluctant, but on the morning of the 3rd of March, 1938, they headed back to well number 7. The well had already dropped a couple thousand feet, but it wasn't until they reached a depth of 4,727 feet that the smell of sulfur filled the air. Finally, they found what they were looking for: crude oil. But it wasn't just any old crude oil well. It was an unrelenting supply. It was this well that would become the largest supply of crude oil all over the world. When the king received the news, he wasn't immediately impressed. He was unaware that this discovery was about to change Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world. It took a whole year for him to decide to head out to the pumping station. He arrived there in a caravan of around 400 automobiles, just in time to see the first tanker haul away the cargo of Saudi crude. This meant that he would not have to rely on the business of pilgrims on their way to Mecca anymore. The discovery allowed the Saudis to establish a strong infrastructure with wells, pipelines, ports, and refineries dotting the arid expanse. The kingdom's petroleum wealth would emerge as a crucial aspect of Middle Eastern politics and the bargaining over global energy supplies. This continuation of the dig for crude oil led to Saudi Arabia becoming the world's largest producer and exporter of oil. The trade ultimately fostered the sophisticated relationships between the country and the West, including Japan, China, and Asia. Industrialized nations are entirely dependent on petroleum imports. Today, millions of foreign workers from all over the world live and work in Saudi Arabia, all thanks to that fortunate discovery. Aside from becoming a business opportunity, the discovery allowed for lower prices, fueled global economic growth, and gave Saudi Arabia geopolitical influence. In addition to this, in 1945, a bargain was made between the country and the United States. In exchange for a steady oil supply from Saudi Arabia, the United States offered security against great powers and regional ones. The drilling of well number 7 ultimately uncovered the king's fortune. The Black Canyon of Gunnison National Park serves as an incredible landscape shaped by millennia of geological activity. The park finds itself nestled in Colorado and was established as a national monument in 1933, given its rich history. The park had once been a site of significance for the indigenous people, who called the rugged landscape home some 9,000 years ago. The early inhabitants of the area had come in search of resources such as water or routes for trade and transport, but the jagged cliffs and steep downfalls posed some challenges for such ventures, leaving only the canyon's rim occupiable and safe for visitors to travel on. Geologically, the canyon is a marvel, but its rocky walls that plunge to steep depths make it a dangerous venture. Nonetheless, the park has become a destination for many outdoor enthusiasts. Hiking trails wind through the area alongside steep drop-offs and tall peaks. The environment is one that requires proper consideration, since it can be unpredictable. During the mid-spring and fall seasons, water comes limited, only complicating these ventures even further. One man who decided to take the dangerous hike was Jordan Masters, who found himself drawn to its majesty. Not much is known about Jordan's history, but it's believed that he was a nature lover. On the 11th of February, the 31-year-old was in search of an escape and departed his Denver home that day to find it. Jordan would find tranquility in the Gunnison and journey through Grand Junction and Montrose. After 2 days on the road, on the 13th of February, Jordan finally made it to his destination in his rental car, a white Kia Fuente bearing the Texas license plate TX4349. Around 7:20 that morning, the hiker would be spotted by park personnel. He was seen wearing a black hoodie layered with a tan jacket, allowing him to blend in perfectly into the surroundings. This would be the last time that anyone would see Jordan Masters. The National Park Service never revealed if the man had arrived at the park with anyone else that day, or if he was seen conversing with any other hikers there. Not many details about this individual have been shared, including who reported him missing. Many questions about the trip and its intentions were left unanswered. The time leading to Jordan's disappearance remains unclear as well. No one knows how long he would be staying or if he had informed any family of his trip there. It's also uncertain if he knew the trails well or if this was his first time with them. What is known, though, is that when Jordan entered the park, he vanished without a trace. Family and friends haven't heard from him since the departure, which prompted the National Park Service and deputies of the Montrose County Sheriff's Office to launch an extensive search. Potential leads soon dwindled, and no physical clues were materializing. Still, search teams equipped with the latest technology scoured the terrain, hoping that something might emerge that would lead them to Jordan, but nothing ever did. Time trods on without a resolution in this case. The Black Canyon now harbors the story of one hiker lost in its depths. Jordan Masters is said to stand at a height of 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing around 140 pounds. He has blonde hair and blue eyes. It hasn't been revealed if the white Kia has been found or not. The community has rallied together as efforts are still underway, urging locals and visitors to report any sighting or information, and this information can be directed to the National Park at 970-249-1914. Maria Krauss, a 38-year-old woman, had been residing in Wall, Pennsylvania, a small borough that North Versailles surrounds. Wall is known to be a tight-knit community that now finds itself shaken by a mystery: the disappearance of Maria. It was the 10th of February around 8:45 a.m. when she was last seen, yet the identity of the last person to have seen the now missing woman remains unknown. The circumstances surrounding the vanishing have left the community, family, and friends baffled. Initially, it wasn't clear who had reported the woman missing, or how they'd come to discover that she had disappeared. Family members became worried when they couldn't reach her. Their phone calls went unanswered, and it seemed as though Maria's phone had been turned off. The lack of communication was nothing short of alarming, since the woman was known to stay in contact with loved ones. That same day at around 2 p.m., a strange discovery was made. It was an abandoned vehicle parked along the road of East Pittsburgh, McKeesport Boulevard, and Braddock Avenues in North Versailles. The car was Maria's. The metalworking plant nearby and the railroad that runs alongside a tributary meant that this area was particularly quiet. The find had raised some serious questions as to how it had ended up there and why. Speculation painted the picture of a possible breakdown or running low on gas, but no proof could support such ideas. Later, witnesses would report that they'd seen a woman matching Maria's description walking along the road around 12:30 that day. This revelation only fueled hopes that she'd become stranded and simply left her car in search of help. These sightings, though, did very little to ease the anxiety left by the family, who believed that Maria would have phoned them if she was in trouble. The lack of communication led many to believe that something more troubling may have unfolded. As concerns continued to mount, local authorities, along with fire and rescue, community members, and family, united. They headed to the area and began scouring it from top to bottom. Efforts called in training dogs, who combed the area for a scent while drones surveyed the terrain above. But despite all these efforts and all those involved, no trace of Maria has emerged. As days turned into weeks, the urgency in finding the woman only increases, with the local news outlets drawing attention to the case and the community raising awareness through social media. Family and friends plead for any information that may lead to Maria Krauss's return. She's said to be 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighed 215 pounds. She had brown hair and hazel eyes. She was last seen wearing black pants and leggings as well as a black hoodie. The missing woman has some distinctive features, including a lower lip piercing on the right and a nose piercing on the left. Photographs also suggest that she may be wearing eyeglasses with a black frame. Information regarding Maria's potential whereabouts should be directed to the Allegheny County Police Department's General Investigation Unit at 412-473-1251. Jerry Wilkins was the oldest of 4 siblings. The Childersburg community of Talladega County in Alabama reviewed him as a bright man. At 21 years old, Jerry was just starting the ventures into adulthood and would find this coming to a screeching halt. On the 3rd of January, he left the confines of his safe home after informing his stepmother that he'd be going to a barbershop in Lincoln to get his haircut. He climbed into his white 2013 Yukon XL with a black front bumper and a personalized University of Alabama license plate that read PLYSAX and set out to have his hair trimmed. This visit to Lincoln, though, would take an unexpected turn when he failed to show up for an appointment. Hours had gone by and the family hadn't heard from him. It was a silence that made them concerned for the young man's well-being. His stepmother, who was the last known person to have seen him, stated that he'd been in good spirits. He didn't appear to have been in distress, and all appeared in order. Jerry, though, has been on medication for a condition that he didn't take with him upon leaving, which only made his family even more concerned. Adding to the fear that something bad may have happened to him, his family would soon discover that they also had no way of communicating with him, since he left behind his cell phone too. This would have been a crucial tool not only in communications, but also his phone may have been trackable, ultimately leading to his whereabouts. Since his disappearance, Jerry hasn't used any of his debit or credit cards. As news spread through the county, the community, family, and friends came together, hoping that they might find any clues that may lead to his discovery. In the following days, some tips began to come through. One witness was said to have seen the Yukon in Lincoln around 11 a.m. on the day he vanished. This was just 1 hour after he left his home. Despite this information, the weeks trotted on, and months drew to a close with no revelations being made. Jerry's mother, Carissa, expressed that she just wanted to know that her son was okay, and believed that there was someone out there who knew where he was. The Talladega County Sheriff's Office took on the case and conducted multiple searches in the surrounding areas. Even though they had used different methods, including ground and aerial searches, no clues as to the man's whereabouts surfaced. Later, an investigation diving team known as Exploring the Nug joined the forces with the local law enforcement. They went to the Coosa River near Childersburg and searched it for any traces of Jerry's vehicle, believing that an accident could have sent him into the water. The team uncovered an older car, a Dodge Charger, submerged in the water, but this was found to be unrelated to Jerry's case. But his vehicle was never found. Sometime after the disappearance, investigators received a lead. Traffic cameras had spotted Jerry and his Yukon in the Lincoln area. This find led search teams to the area, and search efforts were re-energized, but again the efforts proved futile, and no clues emerged. Jerry Wilkins is said to be around 6 feet tall and weighs between 200 and 220 pounds. He was last seen wearing a t-shirt with blue jeans. Information regarding this missing man can be directed to the Talladega County Sheriff's Office at 256-245-5121. Adib Eddie Roana is a well-known figure in the Vestal community of Chenango, New York. It was this area that he'd called home for the past 30 years. Eddie was more than just a man of business. He found himself respected and well-liked by many. He was a pillar of the community and known for his kind demeanor. Eddie owned the Cars R Us, a used car lot located at 1170 Upper Front Street. He became familiar with the locals through his line of work by helping them find the best vehicles and offering friendship. His likability made his sudden vanishing even more disturbing. It was on the 11th of January when the 69-year-old father of 5 was last spotted at the used car lot. It was around noon, and he was conducting business as usual. Witnesses claimed that he appeared to be in good spirits that day and had been engaging with customers with his expected friendliness. But when he failed to return home that day, alarms were sent ringing through the Roana household. 3 days later, Eddie was still MIA, and no one was able to make contact with him. His son Zane, along with other family members, headed to the Broome County Sheriff's Office to report him missing. An investigation was launched in hopes that Eddie may be found in a matter of moments, but the search proved more difficult than expected. With no immediate clues surfacing, police began tracking his phone, which was found to have last updated around 6 p.m. in the area of the car lot. Shortly after that, the device was turned off and hasn't been used since. This left investigators with very limited leads, and the family was deeply concerned for the man's well-being. Zane made a public comment on how his father was a pillar of support for the family and community, hoping that everyone would be on the lookout for him and call in any sightings or tips. As the investigation unfolded, the family offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to the whereabouts of Eddie, but still leads were scarce. The community came together to show support, but critical tips, sightings, and video footage have not yet emerged. Law enforcement has remained hopeful through the investigation and believes that someone saw something unusual that day. That witness may be the key to figuring out what happened to Eddie and their urge to come forward. The case has since been classified as endangered and missing, which has taken a toll on the family and the close-knit community of Vestal. Adib Eddie Roana is said to be 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighs around 180 pounds. He has graying hair and possibly was wearing eyeglasses. Tips regarding this missing man can be directed to the Broome County Sheriff's Office tip line at 607-778-1196. Around 7 p.m. on the 13th of February, Dwayne Scott left a family member's home in the 900 block of Summit Chase Drive in Reading, Pennsylvania. This would be the last time that anyone would see the 59-year-old man. Aside from being a husband and a father, Dwayne was also a cherished member of the community. He has 5 children with his wife, as well as 8 grandchildren, all of whom are concerned about his well-being. Finding this man is urgent, given his complex medical history. 3 years ago, Dwayne suffered a stroke, leaving him with medical issues. On the evening of his disappearance, he announced that he'd be heading to a local bar, although it's uncertain which bar he intended to go to, or if he even arrived there. After leaving the home, though, no one would hear from Dwayne again. The next day, he was due to attend his own birthday party but never showed up, prompting concern among the large family. As hours turned into days, it became more and more clear that something was wrong. Family and friends began asking around and discovered a possible sighting. A witness claimed that they'd spotted the man at Maria's restaurant located on Penn Street. This sighting came on the evening of the vanishing. The small lead sparked some hope, but it never materialized into anything. 2 days had gone by since Dwayne had left the family member's house. For 2 days, he'd been out of touch and missing. It was then that the Pennsylvania State Police took action and issued a missing person endangered advisory for him. Dwayne is considered to be at a great risk of harm. He has diabetes as well as dementia, which may cause confusion and disorientation, all of which is a call for concern. The missing man is also insulin dependent and has a very strict medication regimen. He's supposed to take his medication 4 times daily to control diabetes and is reliant on other medication that prevents or controls seizures. Adding to those medical concerns, Dwayne is also battling stage 4 kidney disease, which also requires daily medication. Brain matter disease has also put this man in need of constant supervision. His health has deteriorated so greatly that he also experiences neuropathy in his legs and no peripheral vision, leading to frequent falls. His wife, Kimberly Scott, has taken it into her own hands to search for her husband. In the evenings, she drives around the neighborhood and around the areas where he was said to have been sighted. She also scours homeless camps and other areas in the city. These searches, though, have yielded no results. As temperatures continue to drop, fears have begun to rise. Family and friends have reached out to local hospitals and shelters in their quest to locate the missing man. Information on Dwayne has been shared across social media in the hopes that someone knows something. Dwayne Scott has been described as an African-American man with black hair and brown eyes. He's said to stand at 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighs around 200 pounds. According to the family, he was last seen wearing a gray coat. Authorities urge that if anyone has seen Dwayne or has any tips that may lead to his whereabouts, to contact the Reading Police Department at 610-655-6116. Clinton Bonell is described as a healthy and hardworking person. He's a proud veteran of Cumberland County who served as a Green Beret and is now retired. At the age of 50, Clinton opted to pursue a new path in life and enrolled in the physician assistant program at Methodist University. He was driven by his desire to help others. Unfortunately, though, Clinton's journey in the program and his studies came to an abrupt stop when he seemingly disappeared into thin air. The disappearance came at an inconvenient time while he was studying for his upcoming exam, which would set his plans on the right path. It all happened on the 27th of January when he'd gone about his usual routine. He'd headed to work at the Fit for Life gym located on Owen Drive in Cumberland County. This was not only a place of work for Clinton, but also a spot where he found enjoyment. After his shift at the gym, he was due to attend classes at Methodist University. He came to his class and then messaged a friend, stating that he'd be arriving home in Fayetteville later that evening. At around 5:45 that afternoon, he was last seen in the Crays Creek area of the county, allegedly talking with someone on the roadside. This was a notable sighting since it marked the last confirmed interaction he had before disappearing without a trace. Since then, no one has heard from or seen Clinton. The following day, he was scheduled to attend his class at the university, but he never showed up. Alarm bells rang through the minds of family and friends when they realized that he was missing. They alerted the authorities, who conducted a wellness check at his home. When officers arrived at the Fayetteville residence, they found something: Clinton's car parked in the driveway, but he was nowhere to be seen. Despite extensive searches of the area, the investigators couldn't find any clues that may lead to the missing man's whereabouts. The case was growing colder by the minute, and concerns were only rising. Then, in a twist, another discovery was made, one that would send shivers down the spines of everyone who knew him. Just 5 miles away from Clinton's home, in the 400 block of Gannett Road, a body was found submerged in a pond. The remains were sent to the medical examiner's office for identification, as the family continued to hold their breath waiting for results. But none came. Today, no further information about the discovery has been made public, but it did send law enforcement back to the missing man's home, where they would conduct another search. But the police never said exactly what they were searching for. But they did reveal that the search did have something to do with the disappearance, and that the investigation was still ongoing, as they pursued every lead that came in. The search efforts would then expand to include a wooded area nearby and specific roads, including Butler Nursery Road and Gandy roads. Despite this, no fresh evidence was found, and Clinton's disappearance remains a mystery. Clinton Bonell is described as a Caucasian male who stands 6 feet tall and weighs around 195 pounds. He's said to have brown hair and brown eyes. He was last seen wearing brown pants, a plaid button-up shirt, and a black hoodie. Clinton's disappearance has been left unsolved. Any information regarding this missing person should be directed to Sergeant J. McLeod at 910-677-5548. It was a regular afternoon on the 2nd of February when Yeppin Long decided to head out on a walk in the surroundings of Pierce Ferry, Arizona, located 8 miles north of Medview. This is a secluded spot that finds itself nestled in the area where the Colorado River flows into Lake Mead along the border of Arizona and Nevada. The area is known for its views that attract nature enthusiasts and offer some concealment from society. The path that leads to Pierce Ferry can be read through a 50-mile drive from Dolan Springs along US 93. It was here that Yeppin was headed on that fateful day. It was around 2 p.m. and she was on foot, taking a walk through a remote area, though the circumstances of her visit are unknown. As the afternoon drew in and sun began to disappear, Yeppin would also vanish. She was gone with seemingly no trace, a disappearance that's been left shrouded in mystery. Very little is known about her history or her motivations. All that was known was that she was missing and needed to be found. Once news circulated about the disappearance, the Mojave County Sheriff's Office intervened. They prompted an extensive search of the area, combing every inch of it in search of clues, leads, and the missing woman herself. According to witnesses, they'd seen the 66-year-old woman wearing a dark-colored sweatshirt, black pants, and blue and orange tennis shoes. This description could have aided anyone who came across her, especially the brightly colored shoes. But even with this description being made public, no new sightings have been reported, only furthering concerns for her well-being. Law enforcement and local volunteers searched the area and surrounding area, but these efforts yielded no results. With no evidence and no sightings, the case of Yeppin began growing cold, with the mystery only strengthening. The beauty of Pierce Ferry is now host to the unfortunate mystery of yet another unsolved disappearance. Yeppin Long has been described as an Asian female in her mid-60s. She has dark hair and brown eyes. She stands at 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighs around 135 pounds. Yeppin's case has been classified as endangered and missing and remains an unsolved mystery, one that hangs heavily on the minds of the community. The Mojave County Sheriff's Office continues to appeal for information that may lead to her discovery. Information regarding the missing woman can be directed to 928-753-0753 with case number 25004-153. I just need some answers. I need some help. It's been a little over a month and nothing's really been accomplished. These are the words spoken by Shay Gandy, a mother grappling with the pain of uncertainty when it comes to the disappearance of her 19-year-old son, John, from Mississippi. John Gandy was described by his mother as a loving person and a friend to many, whose life came to a mysterious halt on the 8th of January. It was on this day, around 5:30 in the afternoon, that he left his girlfriend's apartment located in Waynesboro. According to his girlfriend and witnesses, John had left the apartment and slipped into an unknown vehicle that was said to be red or burgundy in color. This same vehicle would be seen again sometime later in the area of Hollybush Church Road. It drove off, vanishing into the night with John inside. Since that day, no one had seen or heard from the young man. When he hadn't returned home and no one was able to make contact with John, law enforcement began an investigation. They discovered that his phone had last pinged in the area around where he was last seen. The discovery, though, led to no new developments. She believes that something sinister may have happened to her son, but she can't seem to figure out who would want to hurt him or why. The family is desperate for answers and has offered a reward of $7,500 to encourage anyone with information to come forward. Despite this incentive, though, only very few credible tips ever came through. The Waynesboro Police Department, who was handling the case, found themselves hitting a brick wall, and with no breaks in the investigation, they decided to hand the case over to the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. Here, Sheriff Jerry Mosley would take it up and begin following leads into every other possible avenue that could lead to the discovery of the missing man. The search for John continued, but hope was still declining. Despite no leads surfacing, Shay was still undeterred. She decided to take the case into her own hands and initiated community efforts to locate her son. She made use of social media platforms to share his story and bring the community in to assist. Her posts have been spread far and wide, but still no clues have come about that may lead to John's discovery. Instead, Shay has been met with stressful comments that command her to check the rivers and woods. These are all ideas that she'd rather not think about. John is remembered for his passion for sports, particularly football and basketball. He's described as a friendly competitor. In the weeks following his disappearance, friends and family have tried many times to contact him through messages and calls, all of which have gone unanswered. It isn't certain if his phone has been turned off or if he's just unable to respond. Despite the exhaustive searches of Waynesboro, no evidence, clues, or witnesses have surfaced. Authorities continue to follow up with any leads and tirelessly investigate the disappearance. The case has been classified as missing, leaving the community in search of answers. John Gandy is said to have brown eyes and black hair that's said to be styled in short twists. He stands at 5 foot 7 inches tall and weighs around 140 pounds. Details about what he was last seen wearing are unknown. Any information regarding this missing person can be directed to the Waynesboro Police Department at 610-735-3192. In 2025, Kingsley Joseph was living his life on Marden Road, nestled in the Dorchester, Massachusetts community. On the 16th of January this year, the 26-year-old decided to head out on a trip to New York City, a trip that would mark a severe turning point in his life. Kingsley left the safety of his home that day with his eyes on Midtown Manhattan, eager to experience the city. His destination would be the New Yorker Hotel, located at 481 8th Avenue. This was just a few blocks away from many iconic areas and attractions. Upon arrival, Kingsley checked into the hotel and found himself immersed in the vibrancy of New York. During his stay, he maintained communication with his family back in Dorchester, giving them updates on his adventures and the places he'd visited. While he was there, he was seen at many locations, including the Regal movie theater, the local library, and even a Japanese restaurant called Donbaria. But as the days unfolded, the trip would take a concerning turn. On the 27th of January, a few days into his stay, Kingsley suddenly and mysteriously lost contact with his family. The silence was worrying for his loved ones, who were reliant on his updates to ensure that he was safe. Friends and family immediately knew that something was off and reached out to the local authorities when the routine communication ceased. Despite searching for the missing man, police found nothing, and soon the days turned into weeks. With no sightings, clues, or evidence, the circumstances surrounding the vanishing remained unclear. Citizens have kept a lookout, and police have searched the area, but still nothing. It's unknown as to who the last person was to see him, or the circumstances that led up to his disappearance. As time trotted on, law enforcement agencies began appealing to the public for assistance. They urged that if anyone knew anything about what happened to Kingsley, they should come forward. He was reportedly last seen wearing a black jacket and black pants. He was carrying a black backpack along with him at the time. Kingsley Joseph is described as an African-American man who stands at a height of 5 feet and 7 inches tall and weighs around 160 pounds. He has short black hair and is often wearing his large prescription glasses. Anyone with information that may lead to his whereabouts can be directed to 911 or the B3 detectives at 617-343-4712. Belva Day has long been a resident of Mountain Home, Arkansas. She and her husband decided to retire in the 1990s and settled in the area. The 95-year-old woman is known for her vibrant personality as well as her simple lifestyle. She spends much of her day engaging in knitting or crocheting activities. Belva led a peaceful life at her residence, which was not just a house but a sanctuary. The tranquility, though, would be interrupted on the 6th of February when she headed out to pay the electric bill. Belva would be paying the bill at the North Arkansas Electric, a routine errand that would mark the last day anyone would see her. During this errand, Belva vanished into thin air, leaving almost no trace behind. When the family discovered she had not returned home, concerns began to mount, prompting relatives to head to the local authorities. Law enforcement sent out a silver alert in hopes that she would be quickly located, but she never was. The Mountain Home Police Department was quick to react and mobilized multiple resources to aid in the search for Belva. The police first focused their attention on surveillance footage, which they reviewed meticulously. They scoured hours worth of footage from the surrounding area, gathering information that may be crucial in understanding her last movements. During the search, cameras had spotted Belva and her 2003 Buick LeSabre, a beige car. She'd been seen several times throughout Mountain Home, according to Officer Sam Siemens from the MHPD. He explained that the car had first been sighted traveling east on Highway 62 toward the bypass leading to Fulton County. As investigators continued to piece together a potential timeline, they discovered that Belva had been in the vicinity of All Steel Incorporated around 2:20 that afternoon. The last sighting of Belva and her vehicle would come at 4:47 p.m. when it was spotted in Southside. During the search efforts, reports with conflicting sources began to emerge regarding her whereabouts, with some witnesses claiming to have seen the woman a day after the disappearance at her home on the 400 block of High Ridge Court. This alleged sighting came around 9 a.m. on the 7th of February. With the sighting, the police were left with uncertainty. This made it difficult for the authorities to figure out where her last known location was. Adding to these issues was the fact that Belva was living off-grid, meaning that she didn't have a cell phone, a credit card, or any debit cards. This would have allowed authorities to track her movements. Her vehicle also didn't have OnStar capabilities, which only hindered the search efforts. Her license plate has also not triggered any readers in the state, leaving detectives with no leads. Search efforts were launched and included the aid of volunteers, drones, and helicopters sweeping the county. Days have turned into weeks with still no sign of the missing 95-year-old woman, leaving her family worried and wondering what happened to her. Late in the investigation, another sighting arose but is yet to be confirmed. This time it came from Calico Rock, 25 miles away from Mountain Hole. The information revitalized search efforts, but ultimately led nowhere, leaving the disappearance a mystery once more. Belva Day has been described as a Caucasian woman with gray hair and blue eyes. She stands at a height of 5 feet and 2 inches tall and weighs around 100 pounds. Authorities haven't been able to ascertain what she was wearing on the day she vanished. Any information regarding the whereabouts of the missing woman can be directed to the Mountain Home Police Chief, Eddie Griffin, at 870-525-6336. Cicero, the code name for a spy who could have steered World War II into an entirely different direction. His real name was Elias Bazna, born in Pristina. Following his escape from Serbian occupation, he would become the butler of a German consulate advisor, the first secretary of the British ambassador, and then later the private servant of the British ambassador. Among these various career choices, he was also a secret agent for Germany amid the war. In 1943, he had access to documentation and information that could then be sent back to German forces. But Cicero didn't stop at just being a valet. He was able to get close to upper government and would become the back massager of the ambassador, and would be allowed into the embassy bathroom. The ambassador tolerated him because he believed that the man was naive and unintelligent because he couldn't speak any English. Little did they know just how dangerous he truly was. Using a German wax mold, he was able to copy the key to a government safe, and whenever the ambassador went for his shower, the spy began to photograph documents that were locked away in there. Inside that safe were files consisting of the military aid sent from Turkey to the Soviet Union, British bases in the Aegean, and the pressure the British were putting on Turkey to end the war on their side. The documents would be taken by the German industry, except they didn't trust their very own spy. Cicero was distrusted among them, given his allegedly unreliable personality. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop claimed that he was working as a double agent. Even though the German spy had leaked many crucial documents to them, he was unable to gain the trust of the dictator himself. This lack of trust and insecurity ultimately led to the defeat of the German forces. During one of his operations to acquire more documents to sell to the opposing force, Cicero came across the Allies' plan for the D-Day intentions, the invasion of Normandy in France. Codenamed Operation Overlord, this was the very event that would liberate Western Europe from German grasp, which could have been avoided had they listened to their spy. After grabbing images of the documented plans regarding D-Day, Cicero handed them over to his team, but their insecurity led them to discount the information. It was a fatal blunder that saw an immense loss and ultimately paved the way to the end of the Second World War in favor of the Allies. The invention of the steam engine is backed by a rich history. James Watt is often cited as the inventor of the engine, but in actuality, many individuals contributed to the concept. It was an accumulation of ideas that ultimately led to modern-day steam-operated inventions. In fact, the idea of steam power can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. The Greeks already figured out that steam could produce movement. At first, this concept was used to invent the pump back in the late 1600s, when a host of inventors and enthusiasts tweaked the designs until they came up with a favorable result. In 1698, the first useful application of steam was patented. It was Thomas Savery who refined a technique that would aid miners, a concept he detailed in a book titled The Miner's Friend. Its intention was to raise the water in the mines so that they could be drained. Steam would be fed down the pipe going into the water, which would then cool and create sort of a vacuum that sucked up the liquid. The invention would subsequently set off a chain reaction. After further tweaking, refining, and tinkering, Thomas Newcomen made the first successful steam engine using a piston. The first steam-powered piston engine was deployed into a mine in 1712. Again, it would be used as a water pump. But just like the first efforts, this invention caused disastrous explosions in the mines. But it was through trial and error that the first steam engine would be born. Between 1763 and 1776, James Watt would make significant improvements and advancements in this type of technology. By refining previous techniques and establishing new ones, the concept of the steam-powered pump improved. Watt would then design more improvements, including that of the crankshaft and flywheel, that would ultimately lead to the conversion of reciprocating motion into rotation. Through these ventures and developments in steam power, the high-pressure steam engine would come into existence. It was Richard Trevithick who built the first self-propelled steam engine that ran on the road in the early 1800s. Then, 3 years later, the first steam rail locomotive was built, a significant development in the Industrial Revolution that took place between 1760 and 1840. But due to its weight, the rails that it ran on would frequently become bent. Still, in the early 1800s, the idea ended up in the hands of John Blenkinsop, who refined the same techniques even further, leading to the invention of the first steam locomotive to run on a viable railway with the purpose of transporting coal. The shortage of horses and fodder at the time of the Napoleonic Wars made steam haulage an attractive venture. In effect, the locomotives led to reduced production costs, higher profits, and the mass production of consumer goods. New job opportunities were created, and a great number of workers were now needed to not only operate rails, but to operate the heavy machinery in large factories that required coal. Construction projects like bridges and tunnels were made easier. Seaside resorts saw a boom with train excursions, and local shops began to flourish. Trading, travel, and transportation were faster. The dominance of agriculture was coming to an end, and a new way of life emerged. The name Martin Luther King Jr. has often flooded history textbooks in the civil rights movement section. But even though his name comes up again and again, it cannot be stressed enough how much of a pivotal role he played in America, and subsequently the rest of the world, forever securing a better future for all. King was a Baptist minister and a social activist who would end up leading the civil rights movement in the United States from the mid-1950s until his assassination. King sought a life of nonviolence and equality, initially influenced by Henry David Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience. He and many other activists were resisting the segregation laws that separated several races from one another. Jim Crow laws would separate the races in various aspects of life, including schools, residential areas, and even public facilities. African Americans would be educated in separate schools. Water fountains were specifically labeled for one race or another, as were public restrooms. People of color were only allowed to sit in certain areas of public transportation, and were occasionally even forced to move seats or stand to allow other passengers to sit. They were further separated from society by being banned from certain neighborhoods, making it difficult for citizens to find adequate housing. These laws, of course, were not passed without protest. Over the years since their establishment, African Americans began to rise up against these unjustified biases. One such individual was King, who founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and established a group of protesters who would fight against the segregation laws. King would lead various demonstrations, including the Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-in movement, the March on Washington, and the Selma to Montgomery marches. These events would lead to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, as well as the 1965 Voting Rights Act. America was beginning to change. The voices of the African American people were being heard, and they were establishing their presence and their rights with calls for equality. But King and the civil rights movement played a pivotal role beyond America. In fact, he visited countries in West Africa, toured South America, and even found himself protesting in Europe. The movement had also extended far beyond legal victories. Events such as these have influenced art, literature, music, and education. It prompted the fostering of awareness and appreciation of diversity. Today, civil rights are the bedrock of an equitable society where everyone, regardless of race, has the opportunity to thrive. The story of the Titanic is a well-known oceanic tragedy. The vessel was a British luxury passenger liner that sank between the 14th and 15th of April in 1912 during its maiden voyage. The ship was headed to New York City from Southampton, England. After coming into contact with an iceberg, the Titanic began sinking, and immediate evacuations ensued. Some passengers survived, while others did not. The story of the ship that sank inspired several stories, films, and a musical. But that wasn't all that the tragedy would initiate. On the 15th of April in 1912, at around 12:51 a.m., a radio message rang across the Atlantic. The message was CQD MGY 41.46N 50.24W. It was sent by the Marconi radio operator, detailing the location of the RMS Titanic half an hour after it had struck the iceberg. Following this message were several more coming from the ill-fated vessel, but many of those transmissions wouldn't be received, and the radio operators failed to make contact with land. During the communication attempts, airwaves were being clogged back on land by novice radio operators who were spreading false news and misinformation. While the ship's radio and operators were revered for being the reason that 745 passengers survived, the maliciousness of the amateur operators were blamed for the aftermath. The event would lead to concerns about how something so tragic would be allowed to happen, and many questioned what could be done to prevent it altogether. It was after this disastrous event that many issues came to light. One of them was that even though there was a radio and 2 operators on board, it was never intended for emergency communication. Instead, the Marconi room was intended for the use of passengers, allowing them to send telegrams from the ship back home. Even though this was its intended use, there were still issues with the system. The Titanic was one of just 4 ocean liners to employ radio operators, which were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. The two had severely struggled with the volume of requests, which were very difficult to transmit to the Newfoundland Marconi station. The focus on the telegrams would become the first of several mistakes by the operators, who had ignored the warnings of ice in the pathway of the luxury liner. The operators had greatly failed to deliver them to the bridge where they could be reviewed. The sheer neglect of heeding such warnings was even further complicated by competition. That year, Marconi held a monopoly over the radio industry, with the intense rival being Telefunken. This rivalry is what ultimately prevented aid to the struggling ship. When the Titanic started issuing some distress signals, Telefunken operators who answered were instructed by Phillips to keep out. Phillips directly refused to deal with this competition. The result of this led to the largest maritime tragedy. Correct radio communication could have prevented the event entirely. Instead, it only saved a small group of passengers, with only 745 lives out of the 2,240 passengers being saved. The sinking of the ship resulted in massive impacts on radio and broadcasting, given all the confusion and fury. 4 months later, a new law was established, changing the way oceanic vessel communications were handled. The American government would pass the Radio Act of 1912, a law that allowed the government to gain control of the airwaves. It also required that all operators had to hold a federal license to be able to use radio equipment. The act would also restrict amateur users to less than 200-meter bands, which significantly reduced interference and sabotage. For some, this may come as a shock, but onions are actually prohibited trade commodities in the United States. The law in question, the Onion Futures Act, has banned the trading of futures contracts on onions specifically. It's the only produce commodity in the United States that's been prohibited, and there's quite a history behind this odd law that has shaped the country. It all started in 1955 with the Great Onion debacle, the biggest produce scandal. Vince Kasuga, an onion farmer, began growing the bulbs in the Northeast back in the 30s. He was also a commodities trader who at the time was trading commodities futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. The derivative markets emerged from the desire of farmers who sought to lessen the uncertainty of growing and selling agriculture. They wanted to do this by locking in prices. This meant that with futures contracts, they would be able to lock in the future price of their crops, ultimately safeguarding against the risk of a bad harvest that would depress the prices. After finding only bankruptcy in wheat futures, Kasuga traveled down Onion Road, which he was more familiar with since he'd been farming them. It was down this road that he saw a profitable opportunity and teamed up with Sam Siegel, who together devised a cunning plan. A plan that would allow them to make a fortune off of onion futures. Kasuga began purchasing mass amounts of onions from all over the country, and by the fall of 1955, he and his business partner would gain control of 98% of the onions in Chicago. The pair had made physical stashes of loads of onions stored up in warehouses across Chicago. Then Kasuga and Siegel would hold a meeting with other onion farmers who were informed of their great stock. The farmers were threatened and told that if they didn't raise the price of the onions, they would flood the market. So the other growers were forced to agree and began to purchase Kasuga's inventory, who at this point would become known as the Onion King. Following this, though, another opportunity presented itself to the pair, who were already swimming in cash. Taking advantage of the markets, they bought short positions on an incredible amount of onion contracts. The partners then decided to go back on their promises and flooded the market anyway with all of the onions they had stored up. Subsequently, this caused a massive drop in the cost of produce, which dropped lower than the price of the canvas bags they came in. The situation became so out of control that even offering food to hospitals, orphanages, and schools was a failure. Truckloads of the bulbs would then have to be dumped into the Chicago River. Many other farmers were left in financial ruin as a result, and many areas across the United States were left onionless. But by the time the Commodity Exchange Authority figured out what was happening, Kasuga and Siegel had already pocketed millions upon millions of dollars, possibly as much as $8.5 million in profits. With so many farmers meeting financial disaster, and with the rest of the country now having no onions, something had to be done. Congress was forced to hold a hearing, and subsequently the Commodity Exchange Act would be amended and signed into law by Dwight Eisenhower in 1958. The amendment included a stipulation known as the Onions Futures Act, securing the ban on trading onion futures. To this day, onions remain the only banned trading commodity in the United States. With the fall of Constantinople to Ottoman Turks in the mid-1400s, it had long been the dream of the Greeks to recover all of their Greek-inhabited islands that were held by the Turks. This included the Aegean Islands, Anatolia, and even Constantinople. Following the 1821 and 1828 Independence War, the country doubled in size by reclaiming its land, the gathering of which became known as the Megali Idea. Politician Eleutherios Venizelos, who led the Greeks into the Balkan Wars, would also push them to enter the First World War on the Allies' side. Venizelos, though, was opposed by Greece's king, Constantine I, and so in 1917, the Allies forced his abdication, and he was replaced with his son Alexander I. Even though Alexander was the king, he was viewed more as an inexperienced puppet, with Venizelos essentially running the country. By the following year, Greece's borders had expanded greatly, and Venizelos was at the center of it. During the Paris Peace Conference, he was there, and he even negotiated the treaties between various countries and empires. Doing this allowed him to secure new land. This politician aimed to chip away at the Ottoman Empire, resulting in the Greco-Turkish War. Then there was a tragedy. In late September of 1920, King Alexander was in his garden in Athens when his German shepherd was attacked by the groundskeeper's pet monkey. Alexander wrestled the two apart, but was bit by the monkey as a result. Initially, the wounds were non-life-threatening until the sepsis set in. Alexander succumbed to infection by October, marking a major turning point for the country. It was a monkey bite that would completely alter the dynamic of the region. He had no heirs, and by this time, Venizelos was removed from office, leading Constantine I to resume the throne. Subsequently, the Allies would yank support for Greece because during the First World War, Constantine had favored the Central Powers. The country was now left to fend for itself against the Turks. It was a monkey bite that set off a chain reaction that altered the course of history. Greece had lost significant military support from both France and Britain. In 1922, Turkish forces defeated the opposing army, leading to the loss of Smyrna, along with the expulsion of the inhabitants from Anatolia. This was the end of Greece's territorial ambitions and subsequently resulted in a large humanitarian crisis. The country found itself in political instability. The Turks, led by the nationalist leader Mustafa Kemal, defeated the Greeks. It was a tragic loss, one that shouldn't have happened. Not only was Alexander's reign cut short by something as simple and bizarre as a monkey bite, but it would have some long-lasting political consequences for his country. With regard to his demise, Winston Churchill commented that it was no exaggeration to remark that 250,000 lives were lost due to this one monkey bite. This remark indicated that the 1921 to 1922 battles and loss of life could have been avoided had the king lived. The name William McKinley may sound familiar to some. He was the 25th president of the United States. It was under his leadership that the U.S. would go to war with Spain in the late 1800s, with the country acquiring a global empire that included Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. McKinley was a compassionate individual who genuinely cared for the well-being of American workers. It was this position that led him to raise the taxes on imported goods, which served to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition. That being said, by the end of his presidency, McKinley realized that America did need to buy products from other countries in order to support American sales abroad. His presidency would see rapid economic growth, but during his reign, he was accused of being negligent and corrupt. In 1901, his presidency would come to an end, ultimately instating President Theodore Roosevelt as the 26th president. It was that year, on the 6th of September, that anarchist and American laborer Leon Chugos would assassinate McKinley during a public appearance in Buffalo, New York, when he was attending the Pan American Exposition. Chugos believed that one man shouldn't have so much service, and another man should have none. Initially, it was thought that he was part of a much larger conspiracy, but it was concluded that this was a solo act. At first, doctors believed that he would survive the event, even though they were only able to remove a single casing from his body. A few days later, on the 14th, McKinley succumbed to his wounds, and Roosevelt took his place. Even though he was the third president to be assassinated, following Lincoln and Garfield, it was his assassination that would lead to a change, particularly in the security district. Throughout the years, it was sometimes the case that the army or the local police would oversee the safety of the U.S. presidents, but a lot of the time, there was no one protecting them. The high-up figures were left to roam the country without any protection. While the Secret Service was created just months after the Lincoln assassination, their job was not to protect the president, but rather the economy. They were charged with fighting counterfeiting. It would take another 2 assassinations, including that of McKinley, for proper security measures to be taken. Those measures were the call for presidential protection as a full-time national priority. Following the 3rd assassination, Congress would finally spark a change that would be upheld in the years to come. They assigned the Secret Service to the task of ensuring the safety of United States presidents at all times. If it weren't for the assassination of McKinley, presidents, vice presidents, past presidents, future, presidential families, and other distinguished foreign visitors would be at great risk today. It's now the job of the Secret Service to ensure the safety of these high-up individuals. For years, China was a country that existed under a centrally planned economy where the state controlled prices, production, and resource allocations. This way of living, following the Cultural Revolution, would result in stagnation and bring about widespread poverty. That was until an economic miracle allowed China to usher in a new way of living, and it all started with one man, Deng Xiaoping, the most powerful individual in the People's Republic of China. It was he who abandoned the orthodox doctrines and implemented new systems and reforms that altered China's economy. It was the late 1970s when Chairman Mao passed away while the government was seeking solutions to fix the country. Dramatic structural reforms were among the considerations, which included encouraging free market activities, and the state-owned enterprises would ultimately go bankrupt should they not enter the competitive market. For such an economic transformation to take place, courage was needed, along with support from all the country's citizens. During these reforms, Deng realized that China needed Western technology and investment to succeed in this turnaround. His reform would be called the Open Door Policy, which would essentially open its doors to foreign businesses, allowing them to set up operations and initiate investments in the country. Before the implementation of this policy, China's trading partners were the USSR and its satellites, which wasn't enough to stabilize the economy. It was a high-risk maneuver, but it was one that was better than just sitting around and waiting. So in December of 1978, Deng's open door policy was established. The initial step would see 4 special economic zones that were authorized in southern China with tax incentives and low wages that attracted not only foreign capital, but also foreign businesses. With investment in place and domestic agricultural reforms, the Chinese economy began to take off. In fact, it's been regarded as the fastest recorded period of economic growth in world history. The policy would also encourage foreign trade, leading to a surge in both exports and imports. The service sector would also begin to expand. Aside from seeing a sudden economic boom, China's nation transformed into a major global power. The country saw technological advancements with the addition of foreign technology, allowing the industry to become modernized. The country would also be established as a major player in both investment and global trade. It was this chain of events that improved the living standards of the citizens of China. They were promptly yanked from the grips of poverty and underdevelopment. It was the establishment of Deng Xiaoping's open door policy that reshaped Chinese society and subsequently secured an open relationship with foreign countries, ultimately leading to a stronger global economy. The Russian Revolution was an event that saw the end of expired concepts and prompted the birth of new ones, reshaping society and the future as a whole. It began in 1917 when 2 revolutions were at play, marking one of the most explosive events of the 20th century. While violent, it was this event that put an end to the Romanov dynasty and halted the centuries-long rule of the Russian Imperial. For years, social unrest in Russia had been brewing. The early 1900s saw the country as one of the most impoverished in Europe. There was a growing minority of industrial workers, and the peasantry was immeasurable. Western Europe viewed the country as underdeveloped and backwards. The empire at the time was practicing feudalism, which had already mostly disappeared at the end of the Middle Ages throughout the rest of the world. Russia's situation wasn't helped by their late foothold on the Industrial Revolution, which saw a population boom leading to overcrowding and poor living conditions. Wars and conflicts only destabilized the country further until they decided that enough was enough. The first revolution would take place on the 8th of March in 1917, when demonstrators took to the streets of Petrograd, clamoring for bread. They were supported by a massive crowd of industrial workers who were also on strike. The protesters, though, were met with pushback from authorities, but still they maintained their position and refused to leave the streets. A few days later, the Petrograd army garrison was sent out to subdue the uprising, but their efforts began to waver against the uncompromising protesters. In just a few days of the start of the protests, Tsar Nicholas would abdicate the throne, following the formation of a provincial government. This put an end to Russian Romanov rule. It was through this effort that the leaders of the government would begin to establish a new liberal program that saw many improvements to the way of living. They established freedom of speech, the right to strike, and equality before the law. They were in opposition to a violent social revolution, but during these protests, food supply issues only worsened and unrest grew, with food riots erupting all across the country. For a brief period, the revolution increased freedom and ended autocracy. While it led to further instability, it did pave the way for a more radical event, the Second Russian Revolution of that year. On the 6th and 7th of November, leftist revolutionaries launched a nonviolent coup against the provisional government, which had now been assembled by leaders from Russia's bourgeois capitalist class. The revolutionaries were led by the Bolshevik party leader, Vladimir Lenin, who called for a Soviet government, a system that would be ruled by workers, peasants, and soldiers. The Bolsheviks and their allies began occupying government buildings in various locations around Petrograd. Soon, a new government was established under the leadership of Lenin, who would become the dictator of the first communist state. This was the only time in history in which workers seized state power. It was this event that gave humanity a glimpse into a socialist society. It transformed world history, brought an end to the First World War, and brought down 3 whole empires with it. Soldiers began to instruct great armies. Workers elected committees to run the factories, and the lower class threw out the landlords and took control of their land. The Russian Revolution fundamentally altered the 20th century, but established communism as a global ideology, prompting the Cold War and influencing many social and political movements all across the globe. It was this event that contributed to the conditions that would lead to the subsequent arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. With the establishment of the Soviet Union, other advancements, such as the space race, would be made possible. Without the revolution, things may not have progressed in the best interest of modern society. No one knows exactly when the printing press was invented. It may have been an advancement that was established simultaneously in various parts of the world. Some countries may have only prompted such a revolution much later, while others progressed significantly quicker. It would be this development that shaped not only the present, but the future of society as a whole. The oldest known printed texts date back to the first millennium AD in China. It was the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist book. In 1297, the Qingtai magistrate Wang Chen would print out a work on agricultural practices, and 150 years later, Europe's Johannes Gutenberg could also make his breakthrough. It's this German individual who's often cited as being the inventor of the printing press, but it was likely that he was just the one who refined it to the point that it would continue to be used in modern day. Gutenberg was a goldsmith and an inventor whose ventures into the printing press began when he became a political exile from Mainz. It was in the early 1400s when Gutenberg designed a machine that was capable of producing pages and pages of text at incredible speeds. Within 10 years of his initial ventures, he established the basics of his printing press and constructed the prototype. An integral part of Gutenberg's design was the metal he used, which replaced the wood employed in earlier efforts. His design would also replace the printing blocks with each letter, and the European movable type was born. It didn't take long before he began printing the famous 42-line Bible, and soon the printing revolution swept across the Western world. It was a colossal moment in history, one that was about to change society. The printing revolution allowed scientists, philosophers, politicians, and religious people to copy their ideas and distribute them among one another or to the public. As the creation began to spread throughout Europe, printing as a trade allowed for new job opportunities. The concept ran into Italy too, and soon Italian printers would become a successful trade in printed materials. German printers were being used to produce textbooks for students and work papers for private companies. Spain also welcomed the new machine, as did Barcelona and Portugal. From here, things would only progress. In 1501, Pope Alexander VI stated that he would excommunicate anyone who printed manuscripts without the approval of the Church, a threat that John Calvin or Martin Luther did not accept. By 1605, we saw the first official newspaper, The Relation, go into print and begin to be distributed around Strasbourg. Newspapers popped up all over Europe, formalizing the invention's contribution to literary growth, education, and the far-reach availability of information for the citizens of the world. It may sound like a simple invention compared to today's technology, but without it, books, magazines, and newspapers would never have been invented. D-Day is the name given to the history-making invasion that took place on the 6th of June in 1944, amid the Second World War. D-Day saw the invasion of the Normandy beaches in northern France by Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, along with other countries that were involved in the war. This came at a time when France found itself occupied by German armies. More than 150,000 soldiers landed on the Normandy beaches through an assault codenamed Operation Overlord. The D-Day invasion became known as one of the largest naval, land, and air operations to date. Within mere days, over 300,000 troops, around 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of equipment landed in the vicinity of northern France. By the last months of 1944, northern France would be liberated, and by spring of the following year, the Allies successfully defeated the Germans. D-Day was the start of the end of World War II, but it turned out that it was all shaped by an unexpected mistake that began back in May of 1940. It was that year that Germany invaded and took hold of northwestern France. America didn't enter the war until the end of the following year, and by 1942, they, along with Britain, were considered an Allied invasion across the English Channel. In 1943, this plan of invasion began to ramp up. It was also this year that, aware of the pending threat, Erwin Rommel was placed in charge. Rommel would spearhead defense operations in northern France, even though none of the troops knew where the strike would be landing. The German army officer was also charged with completing the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile fortification of bunkers and obstacles. The Allied invasion became known as Operation Overlord, and in January of 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower was appointed the commander of the operation. D-Day was on its way. Weeks before it was due, the Allies carried out a deceptive operation, fooling the Germans. But this wasn't the error that was made. Eisenhower intended for the 5th of June to be the date of the invasion, but due to a bad weather forecast, the entire operation was delayed by 24 hours. With the prediction of improved conditions the next day, Operation Overlord was planned for the 6th of June instead. In Normandy, Erwin Rommel bid farewell to his staff. The weather had been looking miserable, and assumptions were made that the Allies would be forced to postpone their invasion for several weeks. Instead of remaining at his command post, Rommel opted rather to head home to spend time with his wife, Lou, and his son, Manfred. This decision was made because the 6th of June also happened to be Lou's birthday, and he wanted to spend the day with her. So off he went to get her birthday gift, a pair of shoes in Paris. It seemed as though this was the right call. The weather was no doubt incredibly miserable, but the Germans didn't know that their enemies had an advantage. They had discovered that the weather would be clear enough for the next 24 hours to advance on their invasion. Eisenhower had chosen the right day for the planned attack, but Rommel had chosen the wrong day to abandon his post and attend a birthday party instead. The Germans continued their training in anticipation of the coming invasion, which they were led to believe would only occur in a few weeks. Many other commanders also left their headquarters and engaged in exercises or war games. And so, on the 6th of June, with Normandy unprotected, Operation Overlord was good to go, and the Allies stormed the beaches. The forces that Rommel would have been commanding were able to slow the Allies, but they were not able to force them back into the English Channel. By the end of the day, more than 150,000 troops had stormed Normandy's beaches, and in less than a week, the beaches were fully secured by the Allied forces. In August of that year, the Allies liberated Paris, and the Germans were removed from the northwestern France. If Erwin Rommel remained at his headquarters and had not made the error of heading home for a birthday party, the Second World War may have ended a lot differently than it did. Instead, his mistake sparked the beginning of the end of the war. The 1867 sale of Alaska is considered to be the costliest mistake ever to be made in human history. In the mid-1800s, Russia was suffering from many losses. In the years before, they'd been engaged in a profitable fur trade of sea otter pelts in Russian America. The exchange had been going on for more than a century, but in the 1850s, the population of sea otters, which once saw numbers over 300,000, was almost extinct. This, paired with the defeat that they'd suffered from the Crimean War at the hands of France, Turkey, and Britain, was setting Russia on the path of downfall. With very few options left, Russia was under a Tsarist government and concluded that all that was left was to sell its American colony. Great Britain had already shown a keen interest in obtaining Alaska as an addition to its British North America, today known as Canada. During the Crimean War, it had also threatened to take over the area after having attacked the Kamchatka Peninsula. Russia already knew that the economic ambition of the Hudson Bay Company to acquire Alaskan resources made the area vulnerable to the British. But after having lost the war in 1856, the Tsar was in no state to negotiate with Great Britain, or see its colony get absorbed by the much too recent enemy. This forced them to consider a different buyer, the United States, to which Russia had been drawn in the mid-19th century during a common hostility they shared towards Britain. The US became aware of the idea that Russia was looking to sell the Alaskan territory, but following the breakup of the nation, they were in no position to respond to Russian officers in a positive manner. That being said, ardent expansionists still showed an interest in obtaining the territory. Ardent expansionists such as William H. Seward thought that obtaining the area would prove resourceful to the state, and so the internal debate with the Russian government began. During the process of forming a consensus to sell Alaska, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich became the strongest advocate for the sale, but other important officials were against it and contended that the Tsar should hold on to the territory. Despite the reluctance of some, the pressure to sell became insurmountable. Another official in the court argued that the price at which they should sell the territory should reflect its future worth and resources. Eventually, the consensus to sell Alaska was reached, and on the 16th of December, 1866, the final decision was made. For the ultimate price of $7.2 million, Alaska would become the territory of the United States, at just 2 cents an acre. After having acquired the region, the United States found an abundance of resources at its disposal, including oil, gas, and others that far exceed the price that they had purchased it for. Just 6 months after buying the area, the US hit a gold mine, literally, resulting in a rapid influx of more people to Alaska. Ever since, the Alaskan Purchase has become known as one of the costliest mistakes in history, with Russia missing out on an abundance of resources, gold, and a whole lot of money. The Siege of Sardis remains an important event in Turkish history. The Persians seized control of Lydia's capital city, which was a major step forward in the rise of the Persian Empire. It was a victory achieved against all odds through composure, resourcefulness, and keen observation. In fact, the entire operation was largely attributed to a seemingly unimportant mistake. The story of the Siege of Sardis centers around an important individual. In 550 BC, a Persian ruler known as Cyrus the Great established a base that would grow into an empire after he had taken control of Media, a kingdom in ancient Iran. The takeover inevitably led to conflict with the neighboring kingdoms of Lydia, which at the time was a major power in Anatolia. After having been engaged in quite the battle at Pteria in 547 BC, Cyrus decided that invading Lydia and advancing on its capital, Sardis, was the best interest of the Persian Empire. But the ruler of the kingdom, Croesus, was ready for the impending attack with an army that outnumbered Cyrus and his men. It had been formed of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Spartan allies. Despite this, Cyrus and his forces prevailed. They formed a defensive square with his baggage camels at the front and archers in the middle. The stench of the camels greatly disturbed the horses, ultimately disrupting their charge. The trajectory of fire from the bowmen in the center sent the Lydians flowing around the square in some disorder. A swift counterattack by the Persians ended in the defeat of the Lydians, and the city of Sardis fell to the empire. The Lydians' failure, though, was not the grave mistake that was made that day. The mistake rather centered around how the Persians were able to penetrate the city in the first place. When Cyrus the Great arrived at Sardis, he and his men found that the city was unbreachable. It had been placed strategically on a steep hill, giving the city's defenses an advantage. On the walls that surrounded Sardis, there stood Lydian soldiers who were awaiting any signs of an impending attack. From down below and somewhat hidden, Persian soldiers stood and watched. Just then, one of the Lydians accidentally dropped his helmet and it went tumbling down the hill. The soldier began to pursue his fallen headwear, unwittingly revealing a hidden pathway to the Persians who stood nearby. One of the soldiers in Cyrus's army had made a mental note of the ordeal and later scaled the route. Subsequently, he would lead a platoon of soldiers into the fortress, bypassing any and all defenses above. Ultimately, this led to an easy seizure of the Lydian capital, leading to the downfall of Sardis and marking the step in Cyrus's rise to power. In August of 1939, as Europe was edging into another world war, the Soviet Union and Germany signed a non-aggression treaty that allowed Germany to invade Poland and allowing them to expand plans for European domination. After successfully taking over Poland and then France, plans were underway to invade the Soviet Union, despite the non-aggression treaty. The major powers sought to destroy Stalin's regime and establish their own in its place. On the 18th of December the following year, an order was issued for that invasion and was named the Führer Directive 21. The German military plan was to advance up the AA line that ran from the port of Archangel to the port of Astrakhan. This would ultimately place a major section of the Soviet population under the control of Germany. On the 22nd of June in 1941, an order was put into effect. It was Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion force to date. It saw over 3.5 million German troops attacking along the 1,800-mile front. There were 148 divisions, 17 of which formed into 4 groups and lined the vanguard with 3,400 tanks, with the divisions and groups being supported by 2,700 aircraft. The German forces were split into groups, each with their own objectives. With all these contributing features in place, the Germans were off to a good start and were able to push toward their objectives, forcing the Russians to fall apart amid the confusion. On the first day of Operation Barbarossa, 1,800 Soviet aircraft were left in ruins, and by the 6th day, 3 Russian armies were encircled, with more than 320,000 men captured. By the following day, 2 more Russian armies became trapped and subsequently destroyed, with another 300,000 troops taken as prisoners. Despite initially gaining the upper hand, Germany failed to destroy the Soviets and forced them to surrender. Instead, they lost over 1 million men, aircraft, tanks, and weapons. The Soviet Union had rallied to defend itself and launched a counterattack, forcing the German forces to retreat. But the entire mission that sought to destroy the Soviet Union could have been stopped as early as 1935. Stalin had received warnings of an incoming attack, with Moscow having learned of the invasion plans in 1935. Germany's leader had also let the cat out of the bag in 1941 after sending a letter to Stalin. In the letter, he notified the Soviet leader of his plans to redeploy troops from the German-Soviet frontier. He'd even gone as far as giving the date, which was between the 15th and 20th of June. Soviet border guards had received news of the coming invasion too, and passed it along to Stalin, ultimately securing the idea that the Soviet Union was going to be attacked by German forces. But the leader decided to ignore every single one of these warnings. He was distrustful of the intelligence reports that suggested an impending assault. He believed that they were nothing more than rumors, misinformation, or provocations. This ultimately led to the surprise German attack on the USSR, which came to be known as Operation Barbarossa. History is filled with tales of war. There are stories of victories and defeats, the employment of strategy and unheard of tactics. Some of the battles were won with brute force, others with clever planning, and a few with sheer luck. Then we get to the absurd historical wars, such as the Battle of Karanshabesh in 1788, amid the Austro-Turkish War. It was here that the Austrian army would be defeated, but before the actual enemy ever had the chance to show up. The scene was set in Karanshabesh, which was part of the Habsburg monarchy, today known as Romania. The Austrians had quite the army, totaling around 100,000 men. The soldiers decided to set up camp in the area as they prepared to engage with the enemy. The Ottoman army, who were coming from the south. Despite having already suffered many setbacks in their previous altercations, the Austrians were eager to alter the war in their favor. But on this night, the men were particularly exhausted, hungry, and dehydrated. They'd just been marching for days on end with no rest. The men were tense and settling down for the night when they decided that they needed something to boost their spirits. This, of course, came in the form of alcoholic beverages. They purchased such drinks from the local villagers and began their celebration. Officers who'd brought with them their own personal supplies of brandy and wine joined in too. It was a merry atmosphere, and soldiers were in good spirits now. As the night drew on, they became increasingly rowdy, shouting, singing, and letting off their firearms. Amid the festivities, though, a group of cavalrymen would bring an unexpected change. They'd been scouting the area and had spotted something that they thought the Austrian troops should know about. They headed to the camp and told the intoxicated men of an approaching enemy army. The news quickly spread through the camp and panic began to set in. But the cavalrymen had made a crucial error. They had not seen the approaching Ottoman army, but rather a group of local people who sought no trouble. In fact, there were no enemies anywhere in the vicinity. The intoxicated men, though, didn't bother verifying the word they'd received, and rather chose to act in a panic. The information brought about pure chaos as the Austrians began arming themselves with pistols, sabers, and muskets. They began running in all different directions, shouting for their enemies. The confusion led to the men trampling over one another, knocking down their own tents and spilling their beverages throughout the camp. Some even fired at unseen enemies, forcing others to believe that they were under immediate attack. The mayhem prevented anyone from deciphering who was a friend or foe. The officers attempted to restore order to the troop, but it was much too late. They were now fighting one another. With no light source around, soldiers couldn't tell who their own men were and fired at anyone who dared to come near them. By the time the soldiers realized that there was no enemy, it was too late. The party had become a massacre. More than 10,000 soldiers lay unmoving, most of which were wounded by friendly fire. The Austrian troops, the most powerful army in all of Europe, had just suffered the most humiliating defeat, and it was all at their own hands. It was a year into the First World War. America wasn't officially part of it yet, but had been providing the European allies with munitions and supplies as the tensions worsened. This was seen as somewhat of an obstacle for Germany, who decided to set up a massive spy network that was tasked with sabotaging America's production lines, bribery, and various other offenses. Since the beginning of the war, the German embassy in Washington had been involved in organizing many espionage activities in the United States. But with so many spy networks at play, Germany needed the aid of a paymaster, the person who ensures that the spies are paid and are equipped with the necessary equipment. For this network, Germany hired a diplomat and lawyer, Heinrich Albert, the official paymaster of the World War I spy ring in the United States. Despite their attempted secretiveness, the Americans were well aware of the German spy activities, leading them to be habitually monitored by the Secret Service, which saw many German associates being followed and closely watched. This would pay off one fateful day on the 24th of July as Heinrich, armed with a briefcase, stepped onto a train in Harlem, New York. The briefcase was filled with the most crucial information regarding the spy network. It held every name, location, and mission of every spy in the country. Being at the age he was, and with quite the voyage ahead, Heinrich opted for a quick power nap. As he nestled into his seat and placed his briefcase next to him, the diplomat began to fade off to sleep. Sometime later, he groggily awoke and hopped off the train. But as he stood on the platform, Heinrich realized that he didn't have something with him: the briefcase. He hurried back onto the train to his seat and found it was already gone. It turned out that when he stepped on that train back in Harlem, so did Frank Burke, a Secret Service agent who'd been tailing him. By the time Heinrich had gotten back to his seat, Burke had already snatched the briefcase. After spotting the agent, the German gave chase, and Burke was able to evade him by jumping into a trolley, and the briefcase was gone. The papers inside gave the United States everything they needed, including the forging of a myriad of United States passports for the use for German agents, the involvement of the German embassy in the attempted assault on the Maine and New Brunswick Bridge, the full involvement of Boy Ed and Pepin in the plot to set up a pro-German regime, and the placing of multiple explosives aboard the ships that left Hoboken and were headed to Europe with supplies for the Allies. America decided to publish its findings to the public and would now know the full extent of the German activities within the United States. The Americans now had proof of German sabotage, allowing them to send all ambassadors and diplomats back to their country. The crossing of Delaware was another key moment and crucial point in the American Revolution. It was such an important aspect of history that it's been immortalized in an iconic painting. The familiar painting of General George Washington crossing the Delaware River was completed in 1776 by Emanuel Leutze, commemorating leadership, courage, unity, and willingness. In December of 1776, Washington and his troops departed from Pennsylvania and were heading for New Jersey. On Christmas night, the troops were led across the treacherous Delaware amid a fierce blizzard. Once making it to land, the troops, consisting of 2,400 men, would mount a surprise attack on the Hessian forces. This surprise attack became known as the Battle of Trenton, which took place on the 26th of December. The Americans claimed 22 Hessian lives, captured 900 more, and wounded another 98. Throughout the entirety of the battle, Washington's troops only suffered 3 losses. There was no doubt that the surprise attack was a daring feat led by the man who would one day become the nation's first president. It also boosted the morale of the American army. There's no debate that this marked a turning point in history, breathing life into a faltering American Revolution. But what is widely left out in history books is the human error that led to that victory. Lurking about within Washington's headquarters was a British spy who had never been identified. After learning of the plans to cross the Delaware to launch a surprise attack, that spy correctly passed the information along to British Major General James Grant. The general was given word that Washington's army would be attacking north of the river, so he passed the information along to General Leslie and Colonel von Donop. The two officials took the information to Colonel Johann Rall at Trenton, who was in command of the Hessian troop. But Rall did not take the soon-to-be president seriously, nor his troops. He thought of them as nothing more than a disorderly mob and proclaimed that his force would take them on without a fuss. In fact, Rall had dismissed the idea that an attack was even pending, and if it was, he claimed that the men would be able to go at them with a bayonet. He also called into question why they would even need defenses. Rall's decision not to prepare himself and his troops would be a crucial mistake for them. The Hessian troops were weary from the previous night's festivities, although some sources claimed that they were intoxicated. Further aiding Rall's erroneous decision were the false alarms of a growing storm, leading to the idea that an attack would be most unlikely. The error of believing that there was no threat led to a successful attack by the Americans, making for a turning point in the American Revolution and one of the greatest defeats known in military history. The 1970s were a time during which the United States entered into an economic recession, fueled by an interruption in the supply of foreign oils and inflation. New York was just one of the places that was affected by the economic downfall and was on the verge of defaulting on financial obligations. In order to alleviate some pressure, New York cut the funding for many of the city's services, further pressuring the already struggling families. To make matters worse, lightning shattered from the sky on the evening of the 13th of July in 1977. The storm, and a crucial mistake that came after, would lead to even further crippling of the city. It was 9:21 p.m., the middle of the sweltering July, when lightning struck 4 times over Westchester County, hitting a Con Ed substation that sat on the Hudson River. The strike tripped the circuit breakers and subsequently overloaded the main transmission lines. Shortly after, another substation was hit, knocking out 2 more transmission lines. In one of New York City's Con Edison electric facilities, a system operator was on duty, and the situation was well under control. With neighboring facilities all opening their connections to the Con Ed system and making an effort to keep theirs from overloading, if he didn't act fast, the entire facility would have been crippled, and all he had to do was flip a few of the switches, averting a full-blown crisis. But flipping these switches quickly was crucial, and they had to be done in a specific order, a fact that seemed to evade the operator's mind. A few clicks went by, but then he hit the wrong one, and within a matter of minutes, a connection of 230,000 volts with New Jersey closed. The system was overloaded, and by 9:36, the whole Con Edison system was shut down. Most of New York City lost power. Only 2 neighborhoods were left running, since the Long Island Lightning Company powered them. Aside from the 2 areas, New York was plunged into 25 hours of darkness and electricity-free mayhem. 1977 just happened to be the time in which David Berkowitz, affiliated with the Son of Sam, who took orders from a neighbor's dog, was at the peak of his spree. Aside from that, given the turmoil that the US was suffering, New York was just an unhappy place to be. Unemployment rates were at an all-time high, and crimes of desperation were increasing. Being left in darkness for more than a day is no doubt a terrible experience, but the reaction that the general public had to that blackout made matters so much worse for the city altogether. Looters quickly took to the murky streets, smashing out shop windows and stealing furniture, clothing, electronics, and anything else they could get their hands on. Around 4,000 arrests were made, but many managed to evade capture and escaped without repercussions. High levels of fires were reported throughout the city, and in just a single night, the NYC Fire Department would douse well over 1,000 fires, all while dealing with a number of false alarms. The night of the 13th of July in 1977 was the night of terror, all attributed to the flip of the wrong switch. By the end of it, the city saw more than $300 million worth of damage, and more than 1,616 stores were left in ruins. During the 1930s and 40s, for Boston, Massachusetts residents, Coconut Grove was the place to be. It was one of the most eventful nightclubs in the town, and this is where anyone who was anybody would find themselves. On the occasion, the club would find itself cramped, well over the allowed capacity of 460 people. Coconut Grove was one of the most bustling establishments of its time, until that fateful day in 1972. Saturday, the 28th of November, was for the most part uneventful. Duty officers were performing their routine patrols at the Boston Harbor, while residents were greeted with updates on the war in the circulating newspapers. Marines and sailors were returning home for a much-needed rest during Thanksgiving weekend. Those of the 1st Naval District were looking forward to being away from their duties, which meant that they were in for an evening of dinner, dancing, and dates. The most desirable place of them all, of course, was Coconut Grove. With the establishment packed beyond its capacity, a busboy was going about his regular duties. In the darkness, he was in search of an electrical outlet and began to feel around for one. Struggling to locate the socket, the boy lit a match. This would be the first human error of that evening. The flame suddenly set fire to the tropical decor, and in a matter of minutes, the entire establishment was engulfed in flames. The decorations appeared alarmingly flammable, and a littered nightclub with dry pine needles was probably not the best idea either. But there was one fatal flaw caused by human error that led to one of the worst disasters in history. It was the exit doors. The hinges had been placed incorrectly, which meant that they didn't swing outward when pushed, but rather had to be pulled inward. In a panic, the clubgoers rushed to the main entrance, which was a revolving door, but quickly found it jammed with people trying to escape. So instead, they flocked to the exit doors, which they expected to swing outward as most exit doors should, but this was not the case. More than 400 people made way for the exit doors, pressing themselves against it so forcefully that it ultimately prevented the doors from opening. By the end of it, 490 lives were taken, including that of the 4 servicemen belonging to the Wilmington family, Buck Jones, a Hollywood movie star, and a honeymooning couple. After dousing the flames and rounding up the victims, the fire department launched an investigation. They concluded that had the doors swung outwards, like they were supposed to, more than 300 lives would have been saved that day. From that day forward, Coconut Grove was remembered as being one of the most unsafe establishments that led to one of the most fatal nightclub fires in US history. The event, though, had also shaped new safety codes and regulations. It also saw innovations in medical treatment, such as the use of penicillin and plasma to treat burn victims. This material would also come into use during the Second World War to treat the wounded on the battlefield. The 1950s became a historical turning point for aviation, as companies began to make their first forays into jetliners. After having clawed its way from the ashes of the Second World War, Britain took that great leap forward into progression, creating the jet airliner, the de Havilland Comet 1, which became the first to carry paying customers. It was a state-of-the-art jet that boasted many never-before-seen features. One such aspect was the pressurized cabin, allowing the craft to not only fly higher than the others, but also faster. In the spring of 1952, the de Havilland Comet, with passengers aboard, sped off from London Heathrow Airport, going at twice the speed and twice the height of its competitors. Much publicity surrounded the coming of the new era, with the press and public alike hailing the Comet as Britain's first aeronautical engineering, following the devastation of the Second World War. Unfortunately, this newfound pride would not be long-lasting. Repeatedly, various Comet flights began crashing all over the place, one in Rome, then Karachi, and again in Calcutta. It was absolutely devastating. It wasn't until 2 years after its creation that the industry began to wonder if something was wrong with the aircraft. On the 10th of January in 1954, BOAC Flight 781 took off from Rome, As it hovered 29,000 feet above, though, it abruptly disintegrated, prompting the company to ground the comet flights. But days later, they decided that the crafts would once again take flight, and another comet was sent into the air. The same thing happened again. The jetliner ripped apart at the seams. Both incidents ended up claiming 56 lives total. This second incident drew into question of what was causing the comet to rip apart. Today, the answer to this may be shocking, but in the 50s it was a groundbreaking discovery. The cause of the disintegrations was attributed to a design flaw which came at the hands of human error. The error had not only gone overlooked by designers, but also by engineers overseeing the construction of the jetliners. It turned out that having square windows at perfect 90-degree angles was not the best option for an aircraft that's meant to withstand rising pressure. Across the fuselage and the cockpit of the Comet, squares were cut out of the metal, and inside them, panels cut with 90-degree corners were installed. In engineering terms, the sharp corner is referred to as a stress concentration. It's this area with this sharp corner that makes breakage more likely under stress. This is precisely what happened with the Comet. Essentially, the 90-degree corners that were strategically placed along the entirety of the aircraft created metal fatigue. This, added with the high altitude pressure, made for quite a disastrous result. The dangers of metal fatigue and sharp corners were not known at the time, and this was an error that was overlooked by the world's leading engineers and aircraft designers. Ultimately, the company was left with the question of how to fix the corner issue that was leading to such destruction, and it turned out all they had to do was round the corner edges. As we see them today, airliners have rounded windows down the fuselage and around the cockpit, which is the only thing preventing the plane from tearing apart mid-air. The pressurized stress is distributed to other points along the curve instead of in just one sharp corner. In the 50s, coming to this conclusion was not an easy venture. Experts had absolutely no idea why the comets weren't holding up until they began testing the structures by simulating the pressurization of the cabin. And while doing this, they noticed that cracks had begun to appear at the window corners before the fuselage eventually burst. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.